Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to do part 2 of part 1 of the Congress of Vienna. I put the first part of this out, I believe, 2 days ago, and I split it because the video is kind of long, but we're about halfway through. So I'm going to finish up this first part of it. Let's get into it, the Congress of Vienna.
Alexander's stated priorities going into the peace conference kinda depended on his mood, but it mostly had to do with the future of France.
Yeah, and we talked about this at the end of the last video. Alexander is, he's kind of hard to find a historical comparison for because he's just kind of all over the place. He's really the worst. Right? If you were a statesman or a diplomat that had to deal with him, you would absolutely hate being around him, right? Because it's impossible to pin him down to or with anything. He's just all over the map, depending on how he feels, who he's talking to. And so that's where we left off last time, was Alexander making a mad dash at Paris, making a deal with Napoleon, and the rest of the major powers kind of looking at each other like, what in the hell is going on?
As previously discussed, the Allies had all agreed to restore the old Bourbon dynasty to the French throne. The problem was that Alexander didn't like the Bourbon kings. If you look at France's position in Europe, France had an interest in making sure that Central Europe remained fragmented and weak, and outside of the influence of any other great power. To these ends, France had a long history of aligning itself with countries like Poland and Saxony and the Ottoman Empire. This was, of course, a geopolitical thing, but Tsar Alexander thought it was a personal thing, and that the Bourbon kings uniquely had a problem with Russia. Alexander's immediate priority was to keep the Bourbon Louis XVIII off of the French throne. He suggested making Napoleon's 4-year-old son the King of France, but Talleyrand patiently explained to him that this would allow Napoleon to pull the strings from exile. Alexander then tried to put a man named Bernadotte on the French throne. Bernadotte was a former French marshal who had turned against Napoleon and was single-handedly responsible for bringing Sweden into the coalition against France. In the late stages of the war, Bernadotte and Alexander had worked closely together, and Alexander viewed him as the one Frenchman he could trust. Alexander pushed hard for Bernadotte, but Talleyrand wouldn't budge. He and the Allies had all agreed on a Bourbon restoration, and
that probably would have been a coup for France had they been able to get Bernadotte back on the throne. But he's in Sweden, right? Isn't that where he got control of, was Sweden, and then brought Sweden into the war against France?
They all saw Bernadotte for what he was, an attempt to put a Russian puppet on the French throne. Talleyrand explained to Alexander that they couldn't be placing whomever they wished on the French throne, or they were no better than the revolutionaries. The new king needed to be a legitimate French king of royal blood. Alexander got desperate. What about a distant cousin, a younger brother, anybody but Louis XVIII? Talleyrand held firm, and Alexander backed down. An impressive feat, considering that the Russians had Paris under military occupation. A Bourbon king would return to the French throne, and Alexander's dream of a grand Franco-Russian alliance withered and died. I mentioned the Austrian foreign minister before, and how he had a rather dim opinion of the Russian Tsar. Biggest baby on earth and all that. The Austrian foreign minister's name was Clemens von Metternich, and the period we're beginning to cover today is sometimes called the Age of Metternich. That's a clue as to his importance. Metternich would become the architect of the post-war international system, and one of the 19th century's most preeminent figures. Metternich's task was vastly harder than it seemed, because not only was the international system undergoing a stark transformation at the time, but so was Austria. Of course, what I'm referencing here is the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. And now my punishment for bringing up the Holy Roman Empire is that I have to explain what it was. We should begin with the French philosopher Voltaire's famous quip that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. So what was it? The Holy Roman Empire was a Central European institution that had existed in one form or another for over 1,000 years. I say institution because the Holy Roman Empire was by no means a state. Each member of the empire conducted its own foreign policy, with its own military, under its own laws. Hundreds of tiny states were members of this club, this institution, and together they loosely supported a central emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor was a prestigious title with very little actual power behind it. He could call for aid if one of the member states was attacked, but it was up to each independent state whether or not they would respond. In fact, each state had its own unique deal worked out with the imperial crown, which put further limits on the emperor's power. Some were expected to contribute money to military campaigns, but no soldiers. Some were expected to contribute soldiers, but no money. Some were under no obligation to offer anything at all. By the 17th century, the Holy Roman Emperor could no longer even have an opinion on religious matters, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the holy part of their title. Although the imperial crown was remarkably weak, the Holy Roman Emperor usually controlled the most powerful state within the empire. Beginning in the 15th century and continuing up until the Napoleonic Wars, that meant that the Holy Roman Emperor was the Archduke of Austria. Since the 13th century, Austria had been controlled by the Habsburg family. The Habsburgs were one of the most powerful families in Europe, and at times over the last 500 years, they had controlled Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Germany, parts of northern Italy, Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, I could go on. The dynasty was remarkably successful, and what made it especially remarkable is that very little of this territory was gained through conquest. It was instead gained diplomatically. The Austrian Habsburgs had a family motto: "Let others wage war, but thou, happy Austria, marry. For those kingdoms that Mars gives to others, Venus gives to thee." Others conquer through war. The Habsburgs conquer through marriage. Fast forward.
It's kind of a brilliant strategy whenever you think about it, especially because almost every state throughout time has been looking to secure alliances through marriage. And so it's not like this is some unheard of thing where you're going to get, people are going to look at you crazy if you propose a marriage for, some king of some state in Europe. Like it's a common thing. And so, I mean, it makes sense. It was kind of funny when it said Alexander was after the great Franco-Russian alliance. I'm fairly certain if he asked Nicholas II about that great Franco-Russian alliance, he wouldn't be as thrilled about it as Alexander maybe would have been at the time.
Forward to the 19th century. The Holy Roman Emperor was still an Austrian Habsburg, now facing an expansionist France under Napoleon. He learned too late that the Holy Roman Empire was not equipped to face a direct attack. A victorious Napoleon demanded the abolition of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Habsburg Emperor, having decided that this powerless husk was no longer worth defending, agreed. With that, Austria became fully independent under its first emperor, Francis I. I lay all of that groundwork because by 1814, Austria was at a crossroads. The new Empire of Austria had played a critical role in the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. But now what? They could reform the Holy Roman Empire if they wished, but did they wish? When push came to shove, some of the largest members of the empire sided with Napoleon. If the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a military alliance, what good was it? Yes, the title was prestigious, but you could argue that the restrictions within the empire only slowed Austria down, with no clear benefit. Francis, the former Holy Roman Emperor, and the current Austrian Emperor, was sympathetic to this point of view, as was his foreign minister, Metternich. Metternich is sometimes described as a conservative or a reactionary, but that's not quite right. A true reactionary would have fought to reform the Holy Roman Empire, but Metternich happily allowed it to die. He was a realist, not that concerned with ideology, so long as it protected his hard-won peace. In his excellent and definitive biography of Metternich, Wolfram Zeeman writes that, quote, "This, the question of whether Metternich was reactionary, disregards the experiences of human beings who were looking back at 25 years of war and revolution. The question contemporary witnesses asked themselves was whether the more than 3 million dead on the battlefields of Europe had died for any meaningful goal.
And that's a big part of this that's overlooked a lot, is the revolution. People kind of view Napoleon's reign through the moment he took over onwards, right? Because of his ability on the battlefield, because of his battles all over Europe. I understand the thought process. But if you're a leader or a diplomat at the time, what led to Napoleon? It was the French Revolution. In your mind, the French Revolution directly led to the rise of Napoleon. And so if you are on the side of trying to make sure that this doesn't happen again, the goal isn't just to kill or exile or whatever Napoleon, because he's kind of only part of the problem. But the real problem is instability in major states in Europe. So how do we smooth this over to where there aren't huge revolutions, overthrowing established governments, and then being able to do kind of whatever the hell they want and wreak havoc on Europe for 2 to 3 decades?
In many peasant families, there were no male youths left. That 3 million number is on the lower end of the spectrum. I've seen credible estimates of 5 to 7 million when you include civilians. Unthinkable loss. Nobody who lived through this period would ever be the same. Across France, 20% of the men born between 1790 and 1795 were dead. An entire generation of young men had been wiped out. In that same book, Zeeman provides the best summary of Metternich's worldview that I've ever seen. In Metternich's case, coming to terms with the war meant considering the suffering he had witnessed endless times on the battlefields and along the roads. Unnecessary, pointless, even a crime, caused by human delusions of grandeur that, he thought, could pull down the walls protecting civilization and the law as he understood it, at any time and in any place. It was the duty of politics to erect enduring barriers against this possibility.
That's very interesting. That almost sounds like, political talking after the end of the Third Reich in Europe, where it was like, okay, this has been catastrophic on a scale that we don't know if civilization can survive if something isn't done to prevent this going forward, right? And that sounds very close to that kind of thinking of like, okay, regardless of like whose fault it is or whether it's legal technically or illegal, depending on which state it is, the reality is humanity won't survive going this direction. So it has to be curbed in some way, shape, or form. That was kind of the realist view coming out of World War II. That sounds very much like this thought process here.
He opposed this catastrophe on humanitarian grounds, and his lasting commitment was never again. Metternich saw balance between great powers as the answer. He feared a second French Revolution, or something like it, but he couldn't clearly see how Austria could possibly prevent one. However, with a balanced international system, any state seeking to dominate could simply be slapped down by everybody else. This theory for peace played into Austrian strengths. Ever since the French Revolution, Austria had positioned itself as the defender of precedent and tradition and the rule of law. Accordingly, they began to expand their
Imagine that. The quote-unquote Holy Roman Empire protecting precedent, tradition, and rule of law. Quote-unquote, right?
diplomatic influence and cultivate a following of smaller states, especially in Central Europe, who feared being swallowed up by the regional instability that would inevitably follow the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. Before proceeding, it would be helpful to discuss what the Austrian Empire actually was. What we're really talking about here is the personal holdings of the Habsburg family, which included the lands that had been the Duchy of Austria, but it also included the Kingdom of Hungary, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Kingdom of Croatia, along with a hodgepodge of other titles. It may be helpful to look at the ethnic breakdown of the Austrian Empire, because
Yeah, that's really the only way you can do it, I feel like, in a realistic way. And that really is kind of how it's broken up. That's where its issues stem from. That's where its lack of power comes from, is from the ethnic groups within it and the ethnic makeup of certain regions.
this will tell you everything you need to know about Austrian politics. First and foremost, there was the German-speaking core, centered around Vienna and the old Duchy of Austria. Then, there were the Magyars of Hungary, who spoke Hungarian. The third major group were the Bohemians, who spoke Czech. Then, in the borderlands, there were Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, and others who spoke various Slavic languages. To the east, there was Transylvania, whose inhabitants spoke Romanian. There were also regions where the majority spoke Polish and Ukrainian. And although this wasn't the case at this exact moment, the Austrian Empire would soon have a large Italian minority as well. By one count, the Austrian Empire consisted of 14 ethnic groups, speaking 17 different languages. The Austrian Empire was really an incredible experiment, one that you don't see anywhere else in the 19th century. This was not the case of one ethnic group dominating their neighbors. This was a true synthesis of cultures and ethnicities united.
Is this even possible long term? And I don't mean to like be a prick about it, about like, some kind of weird ethnicities can't mix together thing. But like if you have these big groups of very different types of people, is it practical to have them into one big conglomeration that makes up a state? Or is it more practical to break them up kind of in their own regions and have them be their own sort of independent states? Like, I'm wondering what everybody thinks about that. Because obviously you're more powerful and certainly you're more militarily formidable if you're all one big state. But that comes with a whole slew of other issues that Austria runs into later down the line. So I'm curious what everybody thinks about, is it practical to have a state like this?
Under the Habsburg Emperor. In the eyes of the Habsburg Emperor, all of these holdings were, at least theoretically, co-equal, which made administering the empire the world's most complicated balancing act. The constraints within the Habsburg system become clear when you look at the crown's relationship with the Kingdom of Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary was home to more than just the ethnic Hungarian population, and when you add everybody together, it accounted for 35 to 40% of the Austrian Empire's total population. That fact alone should make it clear why there was tension between the Austrian Germans and the Hungarians. The Habsburg Emperor ruled Hungary as their king, but he was not one of them, and so he was bound by severe constitutional limitations. One of these limitations was that the Hungarian king was not allowed to tax the people of Hungary. The local Hungarian aristocracy was allowed to tax the people, but they were under no obligation to pass that money along to their king. Again, this is 35 to 40% of the empire's population we're talking about. This exemption created a massive hole in the imperial budget that Austria was constantly trying to fill. Over the centuries, this arrangement resulted in the Hungarian aristocracy becoming extremely rich, even though the Hungarian people remained quite poor compared to the German-speaking population to the west. The Hungarian king was also constrained when it came to military recruitment. Despite being home to 35 to 40% of the Austrian Empire, Hungarian subjects only made up like 5% of its military. This number could fluctuate. During the Napoleonic Wars, it climbed as high as 20%, but in order to accomplish that, the Habsburg Emperor had to go to the Hungarian aristocracy and give them whatever they wanted. This tenuous constitutional relationship meant that Austria was cursed in a way to be in constant negotiations with itself. The Hungarians were always suspicious of any territorial gains that added more ethnic Germans to the empire. The whole political system was a delicate balance, and if the ethnic Germans got something, the Hungarians always wanted something too. Despite all of its contradictions, the Austrian Empire had a lot of credibility on the international stage. Whatever the reasons, the fact that Austria was not primarily concerned with territorial expansion mattered a lot, especially to all of those tiny Central European states who had recently been made vulnerable by the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. It meant that despite having the weakest military of the great powers, Austria had a lot of friends, at a time when having a lot of friends was a valuable thing to have. None of this was true of the other German great power. In many ways, Austria's mirror opposite. Where Austria was old, they were young. Where Austria was defined by their diversity, they were defined by their Germanness. Where Austria was weaker militarily than they could be, they were stronger militarily than they ought to be. Where Austria was not that interested in territorial expansion, they were obsessed with it to the point where they thought of very little else. The two German great powers were brothers, but they were brothers that did not get along. In 1814, the thing that defined Prussia was its precarity. It was the smallest of the great powers, in every way. It had a tiny population of 10 million people, 3 times less populous than France, and almost 5 times less populous than Russia. It was also small geographically. As you can see, its tiny population was crammed into a bunch of isolated pockets that weren't even connected to each other. It was also precarious in its positioning. As I've already discussed, Central Europe was no longer under the protection of the Holy Roman Empire, which meant that tiny Prussia was now vulnerable to its much larger neighbors. Vulnerable might be underselling it. The Prussians had enlisted Russian help against the French, but now there were Russians everywhere. Poland.
Yeah, and this, okay, so I've done the Otto von Bismarck series, right? Bismarck is, at least in my opinion, one of the more brilliant statesmen of this era, right? I mean, he's after this era, but it's close enough that it's the same issues plaguing all of these countries, right? Prussia's whole thing is they're trying to get onto the world stage. They're trying to not be so vulnerable. They're trying to become a partner and not like a little brother to the other states of Europe, right? And that continues, up till they honestly, up till they get involved with the Franco-Prussian War, when they go down and kind of slap Austria around a little bit. You have this continued kind of thriving to become something different, right? And so Prussia sees Austria not just as a threat, but almost like what they want to be, except without all the different ethnicities and all that, right? Like Prussia is, they take very much, like they grab on and gravitate very much towards that German Prussian ethnic heritage. But other than that, they kind of see in Austria what they want to be. And so in this period before you have the Franco-Prussian War and their fight, their little skirmish with the Danes and then going down to Austria, you have them kind of in the same spot where they're in this push-pull of young, up-and-coming, wanting to be something that they're really not yet. And until they are that, they are in an incredibly, incredibly vulnerable position.
Poland was under joint Russian and Prussian occupation, but there were also Russians occupying the Polish-speaking areas of eastern Prussia, and they weren't leaving. The Russians were also occupying Saxony along Prussia's southern border, and these guys weren't leaving either. Central Europe was in a state of flux. It was clear to everybody that Russia saw opportunity here, which was entirely antithetical to the balance of power principle. The other great powers would have no choice but to respond. In the eyes of people like Metternich and Castlereagh, Russia had to remove itself from Central Europe if there was ever to be peace. Prussia had to become the kind of great power that was capable of resisting Russian influence. That was the priority of the Prussian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Karl August von Hardenberg. The experience with Napoleon had taught Hardenberg that Prussia was not yet a true great power. It was powerful regionally, but it was too small to have a global impact. In order to graduate from a regional power to a great power, Prussia needed people, Prussia needed resources, and Prussia needed territory. This line between a strong regional power and a weak great power is a fuzzy one. Eric Hobsbawm writes that, quote, Austria and Prussia were really great powers by courtesy only. Continuing later, their chief function was to act as European stabilizers.
That is what is so interesting about the kind of envy that Prussia has towards Austria, is that Austria really isn't what Prussia thinks it is, right? It's more kind of tradition and grace and like courtesy. That's a great way to describe it, courtesy. But Prussia sees Austria as this really big dominant power. But in reality, they really are that much more in the sort of German region alliance than they are on the big stage of all of Europe, right? And so that's actually very interesting that it's put that way. They were great powers by courtesy only. Prussia sees itself that way, right? As not really a great power. But they see Austria as most definitely being a great power, which is very interesting since they really weren't.
It's true that Austria and Prussia could not match the global influence of France, Britain, and Russia. I would quibble slightly and say that Austria's diplomatic influence at this time made them a great power, but it's true that Prussia lacked the global reach of any of the other powers. The only reason everybody decided to treat them as a great power was their formidable military. By the end of the war, on a per capita basis, Prussia was fielding 6 times more soldiers than Austria, which meant that despite their relative weakness, they were capable of going toe-to-toe with any other great power. Hardenberg saw in Prussia an urgent need for territorial expansion. All of these isolated enclaves would not do. They were just asking to be swallowed up by some stronger power. In the upcoming peace conference, Prussia hoped to gain some territorial coherence and become a true great power with global influence. The original plan was for the four victorious great powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, to dominate the peace conference and impose their will upon everyone else. But Tsar Alexander's behavior had begun to make people nervous, and Russia's creeping domination over Prussia seemed a disaster waiting to happen. If there was a serious split at the conference, with Britain and Austria on one side and Russia and Prussia on the other, it was difficult to imagine how they could possibly resolve it without descending into another war. Metternich and Castlereagh saw this looming crisis before them, and so they approached Talleyrand and asked him to represent France at Vienna. France remained a great power, and so it made very little sense to exclude them from shaping the post-war world. Besides, Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated and removed from power, which meant that France was theoretically a normal country again. Naturally, nothing could have pleased Talleyrand more. Castlereagh and Metternich pulled in Hardenberg of Prussia, who was still keen on finding a way to resist Russian influence, and got him to agree. This left Tsar Alexander isolated, when the four other great powers came to him and demanded that France be given a seat at the Congress. He, of course, threw a fit, but then reluctantly agreed. Over the summer, everybody traveled to Vienna, and by everybody, I mean everybody. Virtually every state in Europe sent delegations, and some states that didn't even exist anymore sent delegations as well. After decades of war, a festive, slightly euphoric mood took over the city. Peace was at hand. When September rolled around, the real work began.
Okay, so that was the end of part 1 of the Congress of Vienna. Man, this is really good. I'm going to start part 2 soon. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the link to the Discord down below, and I'll see you all next time.